Hello and welcome to the Doublethink Dialogues podcast. So one thing we wanted to, talk about today was there seems to be a cost of housing crisis, at least in the West. In Canada, there's a lot of talk about it, US, UK. So maybe I'd just ask you what your thoughts on that are.
I've been struck a lot by how sort of nonsensical the arguments I've been hearing for years on it are, that people say things which make a kind of superficial sense, and then you think, well, does that, is that really sensible? Like, for example, on one side you have the idea of affordable housing, which is basically that you can reserve some housing and give it to the people at the back of the housing queue. So basically somehow that has made the housing go round, but in fact you've left somebody in the middle of the queue without a house. So it's just, what good has that done, basically? And on the other side, the idea that the answer is for us all to buy a house. And I think I gathered from something I saw lately that there was some big attempt under New Labour to settle this and say, why can't people afford houses? And the conclusion they came to, they brought in some star economist, a woman economist, who was reckoned to be, the hottest thing there was in the study of economics, who came up with a not surprising idea that it's supply and demand. We haven't got enough houses. So they needed to build, the word would not, we need to build a lot more houses, whereupon they thought, well, actually, we haven't got enough money. We need to draw in more money to finance these houses. And very soon you come across a different view of supply and demand. It's not the number of the houses and the number of people who like a house. It's the number of houses and the amount of money chasing those houses. So they brought in more investment in housing and drove the price of houses up. So in order to push the price of houses down, you have to push them up, which seemed to be the conclusion. And this was, the great, the bringing of rational economics to bear on the problem, seemingly.
Yeah, that sort of, I don't know, hypocrisy, I guess I wanted to say, but the sort of counterintuitive, nonsensical, one might say, perspective does seem to be common on, especially on one side of the spectrum at the moment. But it does sort of, describe what I've been seeing in a less conspiratorial way, in that, the more investment, so you get all the big companies then investing in the housing market as well. But you're right, it should mean that housing prices go down, but in fact, because of all the investment and business interest in the sector, they go up instead. We have seven new developments just in our area, in our relatively modest-sized town, and that's just in one segment of the town. I mean, throughout the whole town, there's dozens upon dozens of developments at the moment, and just in that one area, the prices. Everyone who's looked at that I know, who's looked at those houses, has said, well, they're not really that well built. Like, they're okay, but they're not that well built, and they're charging them for the same size house we have, which we bought for $370,000 about 8 years ago. They're charging $460, something like that, as a starting price. So you first think, okay, affordable housing, right? Like you said, affordable housing. But there's no affordable housing here? Like, none of this is affordable. So it's just bizarre.
Yeah, they're taking it down to a personal level. We need money to buy the houses, and so rather than saying, right, we'll bring in Chinese money, which obviously will force things up, it is giving these people who can't afford houses enough money, so help to buy. Which you think, well, does that not push up the price? And does that help? It allows probably the same people to buy, but at a higher price, so they're deeper in debt.
Yeah.
That is, yes, yeah. If you accept, well, actually, what the Conservatives need, and increasingly Labour maybe getting on, maybe after the same people, saying, people who have already invested in houses and are just about to want to see house prices going up. I mean, it's a constant feature that house price rises are simultaneously good news and bad news. How terrible for these buyers, but actually it's pretty good for those of us who've already got a house. So we'll just shed some crocodile tears over the newbies. And
well, that's the thing with these houses going up literally across the street from us. without any analysis at all of what our house is actually worth from anyone coming to see it, the value of our house is already estimated to have risen like 100,000 in value just because of the comparison to the other ones. But you bring up an interesting case with subsidies, which always, again, this, left, right, there are political differences. And one of the differences is the belief in subsidies. I think, maybe I'm wrong, maybe both sides believe in them nowadays. But subsidies seem to definitely be almost a free pass to raise your prices. So as you say, with housing, okay, you give subsidies. Oh, well, then the people who are providing that housing service, the building the houses, oh, well, then the customer has more money, so we can raise our price. It's exactly the same thing that happens in universities, right? So the government gives student loans, student grants. Oh, well, then the students have more money, we can raise our prices. And so it's definitely, while it might seem counterintuitive that that's the wrong thing to do, it is the wrong thing to do, because it just keeps this skyrocketing price, doesn't it?
And it's just an impression you get of economics in general that actually it's impossible to change anything. Whatever you try and do about anything, it will actually have the opposite effect. And if you're lucky, you'll do no damage, but most likely you'll do some damage, and certainly you won't achieve what you intended to achieve or claimed you intended to achieve. I mean, I would wonder, everything since the Great Crash, I would wonder, was that really intended to make houses affordable, or were they frantically fighting off further price crashes? So there never was an intention to cut the prices. It's always been to hold them up and keep them going up, and it's a very cunning wheeze to say, actually, we're trying to make it easier for people to buy them when we're doing just the opposite.
Yeah,
I mean, just how self-consciously or how cynically that was done, I don't know.
Yeah. There's 2 points there, I think. One of them is interesting, that maybe John's laws of economics or something, but it does feel true, because I think if you view sort of the world and the economics situation and finances as the average person does, which is a way or a system they have to navigate in order to survive, basically, right? You have to go to get a job to get money. Whereas you can also view it, I think, as the rich and powerful do, which is more like it's a game that has certain rules that you can manipulate to your own benefit. And if you do that better than anyone else, you end up with more than anyone else, right? And so whatever rules you put in place under that second viewpoint will kind of be irrelevant, because there's always ways around rules. Once you codify something, there's always a way around that code. And we see that in virtually anything. It doesn't matter. Like currently, it's the far left is trying to codify everything in the world especially in terms of relationship structures and things like that. And all that ends up happening is that they have to recodify things, because they're slipping through the cracks of their own codes faster than they can create these codes, because they're basically trying to create a discrete system of rules for an analog structure, right? Which it doesn't work. So we have that. I think it's always going to end up being that way, doesn't it?
I tackled at one point the initial assumption, and I mean, I would have, I'm to an extent a marketeer. I'm not sure that the market is honest, or that but I don't think the problems that are blamed on the market really are, because I doubt if in those cases, I doubt if there is a market working. You're blaming the market for something where we haven't got a market. But I'm loosely a free marketeer. So I was not averse to the idea. Yes, it's simple shortage of houses. But I then, given how silly the conclusions that drove you to, I started to think, well, is there a shortage of houses? And looking around, I mean, I walk to catch a bus through housing estates where otherwise I would drive and not notice. But I think, well, there's an awful lot of big houses here and not many people. And there are 3 and 4 bedroom houses with maybe a couple living. And it's an overall pattern that the conventional wisdom, going back as far as I can remember, which is quite a way, was to stretch yourself and buy the biggest house you can, because they will go up. Up they will go was the mantra, and we're still in. I mean, even if it's ceased, even if it's wobbled a bit, that sort of myth or that belief it isn't breaking yet. So basically, what you have is, and I think people are willing to recognise this as far as, say, owning second homes and Uber lets and or whatever, Airbnb lets. They're prepared to recognise an empty property. They're prepared to recognise house hoarding there, but they're not recognising the extent that the houses actually, the housing space people actually live in exhibits a great deal of hoarding as well, of over occupation. If houses were falling in value relative to other things, as they have done in the 20s and 30s. I mean, there was a time when people would be told, if you're buying a house, people were told, why are you tying your money up in bricks and mortar? That's a recipe for disaster. But it's exactly the opposite now. But people are pouring money into houses and hanging on to a big house after they no longer need it, because that's the best way to hold the money. If the prices weren't going up, then they would, and maybe that's the government's fear. If the prices weren't going up, they'd be going down, because those people would then be coming out of those and saying, right, we can downsize now and put our money somewhere more efficient. So I don't think it's even possible to estimate the degree of house hoarding and just how much of a surplus of housing we might have if we just somehow achieved a state where we said, yes, we now all expect price. I mean, hopefully not to drop, because some people have just bought into the market and that would be quite upsetting for them, but to rise slower than any other measure of inflation, just gently deflate, as it were. And the outpouring of people from property could, I just don't know where that could be the fear that actually that leads you into a crash very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the whole financial system is sort of carefully balanced and barely functional in a way, isn't it? I mean, we bought a house within our means, precisely because we didn't, like, my wife's a doctor. So we have a lot of doctor friends who buy, like you said, big houses. You want to invest, so when you sell it when you're older, you can get a lot of money, etc. But we wanted to live more in our means, so we have a fairly modest house. But yeah, it's interesting. This, and I do wonder how much of the inflation of the housing market is due to the constantly growing population, which has been significant for most of the last century, is becoming less significant. And so is it going to reach a point where the housing prices become artificially inflated to keep the corporations involved in it, wealthy, even when it's not necessary, right? Which could lead a little bit into another topic we've already talked about, we're going to talk about again soon, which is immigration, especially the illegal kind. But yeah, I'm very curious, because a lot of companies have been buying up properties, which at least the conspiracy theorists will say is because of the World Economic Forum's claim that you'll own nothing and be happy. And so the idea is that all these companies are going to buy up all the properties and then rent them out rather than sell them. But it could just be, like you say, part of this whole system of inflation. It's just good money, good business for these guys to hyperinflate the prices. Because the other thing that's weird, and specifically weird with the housing market, is that it's not a commodity that's ever fully bought, right? I mean, you buy the house, okay, but then you go around and sell it. That property's already been paid for once, and often with mortgages through the bank. So the bank's made a lot of money on it. And then the next person comes and buys that, and then the bank gets more money from that purchase, and it just keeps, and you're like, well, that one thing has been already bought.
Yes, the gift that keeps on giving.
Right? Yes. So obviously it's a great investment to have it, but it's very strange that it's never ever finished, paid for, right? It's never like a property that's there and you can trade into it or anything like that. It's always in this sort of purchasing and selling loop. So yeah, I don't know. I'm very curious what the government sometimes means by affordable housing. Hopefully it's not always like the Glenfall incident, which for those of you who don't know, was the apartment buildings that burned down. But
yeah, I mean, affordable is ambiguous. I mean, it could mean reasonably priced. It's a complaint that you're offering us houses at grossly inflated prices, and I can imagine how you could make a reality out of that and say, look, this is the cost of building a house. The rest of the price is the fact that you've inflated demand, has inflated the value of the land, so it's an inflated price. But the other end of the spectrum, it's affordable. The affordable housing means, well, I've got no money. I want a free house, or I want a £10 house, which is actually in the most socialist system in the world, bricklayers and the people who make houses want to be paid. I mean, there is a lower price on houses if you're going to reward the people who turned out on a cold winter's morning to build it. Basically, so I'm skeptical of the demand. I mean, in fact, it's one of those phrases like the one before, which was the one that went with stretch yourself and buy as big a house as you can, which was the get on the housing ladder expression. Right. Affordable housing is the equal and opposite one that makes me inclined to vomit rather when I hear it. But both, they're the two different approaches to, both of which, I think are gravely flawed sort of thing.
You do wonder what they mean by affordable housing when nothing that they're building is actually affordable. Mm-hmm. And this also brings to another issue that we'll have to have for a future podcast, which is the relationship to stated climate-related goals, mm-hmm. environmental goals, because equally so, none of the buildings they're creating are, as you'd expect them to be, built mm-hmm. in a way that would alleviate mm-hmm. any of the, let's say, carbon demands that you'd expect, right? They could be doing a lot more with that, and they're not doing anything. So that would be somewhere that they could fix it as well, and they're not doing it. So, and while all of these fronts, they're building these houses, and they're just putting them up as quick as possible, but they're not meeting any of their own demands. And not only that, but they're not also considering the aesthetics of the area anymore. They're just throwing them out. And we have, like where we live, they could have built so we used to have a green area across the road from us, favored by dog walkers and all kinds of people who just love walking through the green area. And that's all been converted into houses now. And we had a nice big road going through across the entire space of that, which they could have turned into at least a nice boulevard, right? And with maybe tree-lined meridians or on the side. Nothing. There's no consideration. In fact, I've listened to some of the YouTube streamed council meetings, and some of the councillors don't even know that these sites are being built on. Because there was one case where one of the councillors was looking at a map and asked, okay, so what's going on in this spot? Because her map was already out of date and didn't have the new builds. And she was informed there was a new build there. And she's like, oh, well, that's shameful, right? Because the entire area is now being built on.
You signed it off last week.
Exactly.
But you have to keep pretty update around to know, to not be surprised by an entire new housing estate that's sprung up since you last went past.
You do, yeah. Everywhere you drive.
I used to travel on the train up in London and Edinburgh quite a bit, and there was not a pocket-sized handkerchief of land you could see anywhere not being built on, and always the message: we're not building enough houses. Well, are we not? And I say my aunt, my counter to say, well, have we not got enough? Would say, well, what if the price was, what if you ended hoarding by bringing the price down? Where would that leave us? And the thing I would be afraid holds the prices up. If you, as you say, you can bring the prices down quite a lot, and they're still not affordable. So you're relying on rented property. You actually need to bring rents down as well in order to bring the price of houses.
We're getting into a socialist utopia here, basically.
Well, my socialist utopia is one that would certainly outrage most socialists. Hopefully that's my criterion of it. It's okay who does that.
We might have to get into that in a future episode as well.
But it's simply a question of it's not fixing the prices, or it's fixing them, the rents. It's fixing them relative to income. So basically, the amount. It's not saying this house cannot be let for more than $800 a month. It's saying this family with an income of so much cannot pay more than so much rent. So you've got a choice then. Either, if you employ this family, you have to say, well, if you want them to live here, and if they want you to work for them, you need them to live here, in which case you need to pay them more. So you're into a tussle between the landlords and the employers, really, so that the unaffordability of houses becomes an issue between the employer and the landlord, not between the taxpayer and the tenant, with a tenant on one side and the others. And hopefully, if you're forcing the rents down, but still leaving that flexibility, because I'm unlike the socialist, I'm not saying, well, these poor, these people are unfortunate. Obviously, they must have a house here. Well, I think, well, yes, they must have a house somewhere. They can have it in Galloway or anywhere, but they can't have it somewhere where employers want someone else to live. If you can't do the job they want and they're prepared to pay more than you can afford, then you don't get a house here, basically.
I feel like the World Economic Forum might want to hire you after this podcast.
Well, that is what I'm aiming for. Yes.
Because it sounds a little bit like you would be restricting not only that, but the people's freedom to choose a house as well, potentially, if they have a certain employer, for example.
I guess
income level.
It's a kind of. I see it again on since it may be shining a little leaning right. I'm seeing it as akin to trade unionism. Basically, we the tenants get together and say we will not pay more than so much for this or that. But in order to keep the flexibility, basically so that workers who can do the job can get a house where the job is. We're not saying, a fixed price on the house. We're saying, if you want, we won't take that house unless we earn more than, basically, we won't outbid fellow tenants by pushing ourselves into poverty.
In theory, this is more or less how the free market economy should function in a healthy way, isn't it? I mean, where you'd have people who understood the value of certain things, and ideally would not, it gets run away. Once you get a certain amount of wealth, someone will just outbid everyone else by a huge amount and just take it up. And that's so you have the sort of healthy version of it where everyone understands what something's value is worth, and then no one's going to buy it if it's above that value. And then you get the example I gave. So that's the sort of starting point of going crazy, and the free market economy collapsing into cabalism, perhaps, or something, which I think we kind of have now especially within the housing market, right? Where you get the large corporations kind of working together to inflate prices artificially. And you can't reasonably argue that that's a free market economy, because everything's overpriced and set up that way by the companies that are controlling the system.
So I have to be a little careful in advising people that the mitre bubble, don't get into it, because to be honest, I've been saying this to people since 1980 or so. In fact, since the book came out called Downwave: Surviving the Second Great Recession or Depression, I'm not sure which. And basically, anyone who'd listened to my advice over the last 40 years would have been able to sue me for large amounts of money when house buying would have turned out to be immensely profitable. So, but at some point, it will be true, that the point has come now. You will lose if you buy at these prices.
Well, there's the thing with bubbles, isn't there? I mean, they have the expansion and then the contraction. They burst. Let's just state it that way. So yeah, I think that's happened several times, probably since the 80s. And it's if you get in at the right time and get out at the right time, you're fine. Otherwise, you can get burned pretty quickly, can't you? But perhaps we'll call that an episode for today on this topic. We've unlocked a few other topics that we might have to delve into.
And we're on the brink of various other aspects of housing that we probably go for quite a while yet.
Yeah, because it opens, like most of our topics, it opens up a whole can of worms with regards to the structure of society and all of that stuff. So we'll leave it here for now. So if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe to Doublethink Dialogues, and we'll see you on the next episode.